Most conversations fail before the first word is even spoken. Not because people lack intelligence, not because they lack good ideas, but because they misunderstand what communication actually is. Here is the shocking truth. People rarely change their minds because of logic. Research in psychology repeatedly shows that decisions are driven primarily by emotion, identity, and social perception. Logic usually arrives later, serving only as the explanation for a choice that was already made subconsciously. This means the way most people try to communicate is fundamentally flawed. They focus on arguments. They explain harder. They repeat their points more clearly, hoping that better logic will produce agreement. But communication at the highest level works differently. The most influential communicators are not the ones who speak the most. They are the ones who understand people the best. They notice emotional signals, hidden motivations, and subtle shifts in tone that others completely miss. Because of this awareness, their words land differently. They guide conversations rather than forcing them. They ask questions that reshape thinking. They create clarity where others create conflict. Communication, when truly mastered, becomes far more than speaking well. It becomes the ability to understand human behavior and quietly influence the direction of every conversation you enter. Before we begin, if you're done waiting for motivation to find you, hit like. Not for me, for you. And subscribe only if you're serious about building the version you keep talking about. Chapter 1. The split-second advantage. Most people believe communication begins when someone opens their mouth. In reality, the most important part of communication happens long before the first word is spoken. It happens in the silent milliseconds when your mind interprets signals, evaluates intentions, and chooses how to respond. Elite communicators understand something that most people never notice. Conversation is not primarily about speaking. It is about processing. Before a response leaves your mouth, your brain is already performing complex calculations. It is reading body language, detecting emotional signals, evaluating power dynamics, predicting reactions, and selecting the response that will create the most effective outcome. The difference between someone who struggles in conversations and someone who consistently guides them is rarely intelligence. It is processing speed and situational awareness. Your brain receives an overwhelming amount of information every second. Scientific estimates suggest that the human nervous system takes in millions of sensory signals at any given moment. Yet the conscious mind is only capable of focusing on a tiny fraction of that data. Most people filter out almost everything automatically. This means that during conversations, the majority of people are operating with extremely limited awareness. They focus almost entirely on the literal words being spoken. They miss the deeper layers of meaning that are constantly being transmitted through tone, posture, pacing, and emotional energy. Elite communicators train themselves to capture more of this information in real time. This expanded awareness creates what can be described as a split-second advantage. While others are reacting only to what is said, you begin to see what is actually happening. The first layer of this advantage is contextual awareness. Average communicators hear sentences. Skilled communicators read situations. When someone speaks, the literal words are only one piece of the message. Their tone reveals emotional state. Their posture reveals confidence or defensiveness. Their pacing reveals comfort or anxiety. Their eye contact reveals engagement or hesitation. At the same time, there are broader contextual dynamics unfolding around the conversation. Who holds authority in the room? Who is trying to impress someone? Who feels threatened by the topic being discussed? Who is quietly observing rather than speaking? These signals form a hidden map of the conversation. Elite communicators learn to observe these dynamics almost automatically. As they listen, their mind asks strategic questions beneath the surface of the dialogue. What is this person actually trying to accomplish? What are they not saying? What outcome would make them feel successful in this conversation? What pressures might be influencing their responses? This level of awareness transforms communication from a reactive activity into a strategic one. One of the most effective ways to train this ability is through what can be called the three-layer listening technique. The first layer is the literal layer. This is the surface level, the words being spoken. The second layer is the emotional layer. This is where you ask what the person is feeling while they speak. Are they confident, defensive, frustrated, enthusiastic? Emotional tone often reveals more truth than the actual words. The third layer is the strategic layer. This is where you analyze what the person is trying to achieve. Every statement in a conversation moves the interaction toward a certain direction. Understanding that direction gives you enormous strategic clarity. Most people remain stuck on the first layer. Masters operate on all three simultaneously. The second component of the split-second advantage is pattern recognition. Elite communicators build an internal library of behavioral patterns. Over time, they begin to recognize different personality styles, communication preferences, and decision-making patterns. When someone begins speaking, experienced communicators can quickly categorize how that person is likely to think and respond. Some individuals respond primarily to logic and evidence. Others respond more strongly to emotional resonance. Some prioritize efficiency and outcomes, while others prioritize relationships and collaboration. Recognizing these patterns allows you to tailor your communication approach instantly. Instead of using the same communication style with everyone, you adapt your message to the psychological framework of the person you are speaking with. The analytical thinker appreciates structured arguments and data. The relationship-focused individual values empathy and acknowledgement. The results-driven decision-maker prefers concise conclusions and actionable outcomes. The creative thinker responds to possibilities, narratives, and visionary ideas. When you recognize these patterns early in a conversation, your communication becomes dramatically more effective. The third dimension of elite processing is predictive thinking. Masters of communication rarely operate only in the present moment. Instead, they are thinking several steps ahead. Like skilled chess players, they consider how each statement may influence the next response. They anticipate objections before they appear. They prepare answers to questions that have not yet been asked. This predictive mindset creates the illusion of thinking quickly. In reality, the communicator has already explored the conversation mentally before it happens. Preparation is one of the most powerful tools in communication. Before entering important discussions, elite communicators mentally simulate possible outcomes. They imagine the most likely objections, the most difficult questions, and the strongest counterarguments. Then they prepare responses that address those possibilities calmly and clearly. When the real conversation unfolds, they appear composed and quick-thinking, not because they are improvising perfectly, but because they have already rehearsed the terrain mentally. The fourth element of the split-second advantage is emotional processing. Conversations are emotional environments. Even highly logical discussions are influenced by feelings such as pride, fear, frustration, excitement, and insecurity. Most people are easily hijacked by these emotions. When tension rises, their thinking becomes narrow and reactive. Elite communicators maintain what can be called emotional overhead. They are aware of the emotional atmosphere in the room without being controlled by it. They notice when someone is becoming defensive. They recognize when frustration is rising. They sense when enthusiasm is building. But instead of reacting impulsively, they observe these emotional shifts with strategic calm. This emotional awareness allows them to respond in ways that guide the emotional direction of the conversation rather than becoming trapped within it. The final piece of the split-second advantage is response flexibility. Most people communicate using only one or two habitual styles. Some people are consistently analytical. Others rely primarily on emotional appeal. Some default to direct confrontation, while others avoid conflict entirely. Elite communicators develop a wide range of communication approaches. They can shift from logical analysis to emotional connection. They can move from collaborative discussion to decisive leadership. They can soften their tone to build rapport or sharpen it to emphasize urgency. This flexibility is not manipulation. It is adaptation. Just as a skilled driver adjusts speed and steering based on road conditions, a skilled communicator adjusts style based on social conditions. When you combine contextual awareness, pattern recognition, predictive thinking, emotional intelligence, and response flexibility, communication begins to feel very different. Instead of reacting to conversations as they unfold, you begin to guide them. You recognize signals others miss. You anticipate dynamics before they escalate. You adapt your responses with precision, and that split-second advantage changes everything. Because in the world of communication, the person who understands the situation fastest is almost always the person who influences the outcome. Chapter 2. The Instant Influence Framework. Human beings like to believe they make decisions through logic. We like to imagine that we carefully evaluate facts, compare evidence, and then arrive at rational conclusions. But decades of psychological research reveal a different reality. Most human decisions are influenced by subconscious triggers long before conscious reasoning begins. Logic often arrives later, not as the cause of the decision, but as the justification for it. Elite communicators understand this distinction. They know that influence does not begin with arguments or pressure. It begins with an understanding of the psychological forces that quietly guide human behavior. Every person you speak with is operating with a mental framework shaped by instincts, emotional patterns, and social conditioning. These frameworks respond predictably to certain signals. When those signals appear, people feel an internal pull toward particular decisions, often without realizing why. This is not manipulation. It is simply the architecture of human psychology. When you understand these psychological triggers, communication becomes far more effective. Instead of pushing ideas against resistance, you align your message with the natural patterns of human decision-making. One of the most powerful of these triggers is reciprocity. Human beings have a deeply ingrained tendency to return favors. When someone gives us something, whether it is help, information, kindness, or attention, we feel a subtle psychological pressure to respond in kind. Most people misunderstand how reciprocity works. They treat it as a direct exchange, give something, and immediately ask for something in return. But this approach often feels transactional and obvious. Elite communicators use reciprocity differently. They create value long before they need anything. They share useful insights. They offer assistance. They introduce people who may benefit from knowing each other. Sometimes the value they provide is as simple as genuine attention and thoughtful listening. When these gestures are authentic, they create a quiet psychological balance. The other person begins to feel that they have received something meaningful. Later, when you make a request or propose an idea, they are naturally inclined to reciprocate. The second major influence trigger is social proof. Humans are social learners. When we are uncertain about what to do, we instinctively look to others for guidance. If people similar to us are taking a particular action, we begin to see that action as safe and reasonable. This instinct becomes especially powerful in unfamiliar or complex situations. Rather than trying to convince someone directly, elite communicators often show how others have already taken the path they are recommending. But the effectiveness of social proof depends on similarity. If you want to persuade an analytical professional, stories about creative entrepreneurs may not resonate. If you want to influence a cautious decision-maker, examples of reckless risk-taking will likely create resistance. The most persuasive social proof comes from people who closely resemble your listener in identity, role, or values. When someone sees that people like them have already made a particular decision and benefited from it, resistance often dissolves naturally. The third psychological trigger is commitment and consistency. Once people publicly express a belief or take a position, they feel internal pressure to remain consistent with that stance. Inconsistent behavior creates psychological discomfort, so people naturally try to align their future decisions with their past statements. Elite communicators use this tendency by guiding conversations through strategic questions. Instead of telling someone what they should believe, they help the person articulate their own values and priorities. For example, rather than saying that someone should prioritize long-term health, a communicator might ask, "Do you believe maintaining good health is important for living a fulfilling life?" When the person agrees, they have publicly committed to a value. Later, when actions related to that value are suggested, rejecting them becomes psychologically difficult. The communicator has not forced a conclusion. They have simply helped the individual recognize their own beliefs. Another powerful influence trigger is authority. Human beings instinctively defer to individuals they perceive as knowledgeable or competent. Authority signals suggest safety, expertise, and reliability. However, real authority does not come primarily from titles or formal positions. True authority is communicated through demonstrated understanding. When someone speaks with clarity, references specific experience, and explains complex issues in simple terms, listeners begin to perceive them as credible. Elite communicators strengthen this perception through precise language and confident delivery. They avoid vague statements. They provide concrete examples. They reference real outcomes and measurable results. Authority is communicated through certainty of understanding, not through loudness or dominance. Another important trigger is scarcity. People place higher value on things that appear limited or time-sensitive. Opportunities that seem abundant often lose their urgency, while those that appear rare gain attention and priority. Many people misuse scarcity by creating artificial pressure. Obvious tactics like exaggerated deadlines or exaggerated exclusivity often trigger skepticism. Skilled communicators use scarcity more subtly. Instead of inventing urgency, they highlight real constraints. Time is always limited. Opportunities often have natural windows. Delays can create real consequences. When people clearly understand these realities, urgency emerges naturally without the need for manipulation. The next influence trigger is liking. People are more open to ideas from individuals they like and trust. But liking is not simply about being pleasant or agreeable. Research consistently shows that we tend to like people who share similarities with us, who show genuine appreciation, and who appear supportive of our goals. Elite communicators build rapport by identifying authentic points of connection. These connections might come from shared experiences, common challenges, similar values, or mutual interests. They also give sincere recognition. Compliments that are specific and genuine build goodwill far more effectively than generic praise. Most importantly, they position conversations as collaborative efforts rather than confrontations. Instead of approaching discussions as battles to win, they frame them as shared problem-solving opportunities. The final psychological trigger in this framework is loss aversion. Human beings are far more sensitive to potential losses than potential gains. The possibility of losing something we already value often motivates action more strongly than the promise of new benefits. Elite communicators understand this dynamic. Rather than focusing exclusively on the advantages of a proposed action, they also highlight the cost of inaction. What opportunities might disappear if the current situation continues? What risks might increase over time? What advantages might competitors gain by moving first? This perspective does not rely on fear. Instead, it provides a more complete understanding of the situation. When people see both sides of the equation, the benefits of action and the costs of delay, the motivation to move forward becomes stronger and more rational. These psychological triggers form the foundation of strategic influence. When used ethically, they do not manipulate people into decisions that harm them. Instead, they help clarify motivations, highlight consequences, and align actions with genuine goals. Influence at its highest level is not about forcing agreement. It is about creating conditions where the right decision becomes obvious. And when you understand these principles deeply, conversations begin to shift in subtle but powerful ways. Resistance becomes curiosity. Skepticism becomes consideration. Conversations that once felt like arguments become moments of alignment. Because the most effective communication does not push people toward a decision. It helps them arrive at the decision themselves. Chapter 3. Strategic listening. Most people believe that the power in communication belongs to the person who speaks the most clearly or the most confidently. But if you observe the individuals who consistently influence decisions, guide negotiations, and lead complex discussions, you will notice something surprising. They speak less than most people, and they listen far more strategically. The greatest communicators in the world are not merely skilled speakers. They are disciplined listeners who understand that every conversation contains valuable information waiting to be uncovered. While most people are mentally preparing their next sentence, strategic communicators are gathering intelligence. They are studying motivations, identifying emotional signals, mapping power structures, and learning exactly how the other person sees the world. By the time they speak, they already understand the psychological landscape of the conversation. This is why their words often land with such precision. Strategic listening is not passive. It is an active process of observation, analysis, and positioning. When practiced deliberately, it transforms every conversation into a source of insight and influence. The first level of strategic listening can be described as emotional archaeology. When people speak, their words often represent only the surface layer of their experience. Beneath those words are emotional forces shaping what they say and how they say it. Someone complaining about a project delay may not simply be discussing logistics. They may be expressing frustration about recognition, anxiety about performance expectations, or concern about losing credibility. Someone explaining a business challenge may not only be sharing information. They may be revealing priorities, pressures, or hidden fears about the consequences of failure. Strategic listeners dig beneath the surface. They pay attention not only to what people say, but also to the emotional signals embedded within their speech. Changes in tone, pacing, and emphasis often reveal which topics carry emotional weight. For example, When someone suddenly speaks faster while discussing a particular issue, it may indicate excitement or urgency. When their voice slows and becomes more careful, it may signal caution or uncertainty. These emotional signals reveal what matters most to the speaker. The second level of strategic listening involves uncovering values. Every individual operates according to a hierarchy of priorities, even if they have never articulated those priorities consciously. Some people value stability above all else. Others value progress, recognition, autonomy, or creativity. These values shape how people interpret situations and make decisions. Strategic communicators learn to identify these value systems by observing the language people use when describing success and frustration. When someone repeatedly complains about a lack of recognition, it suggests that appreciation is an important value for them. When someone frequently emphasizes efficiency and results, it suggests that productivity and measurable outcomes are central to their thinking. Conversely, when someone proudly describes moments where collaboration succeeded, it often reveals that relationships and teamwork hold significant importance. By understanding these values, you gain the ability to frame ideas in ways that align with the listener's internal motivations. The third layer of strategic listening is authority mapping. In almost every environment, organizations, communities, even social circles, there are hidden structures of influence. Formal titles do not always reflect who truly shapes decisions. Strategic communicators pay close attention to subtle signals that reveal where authority actually resides. When someone mentions particular colleagues repeatedly, it may indicate whose opinions they respect. When someone pauses before answering certain questions, it may suggest they are considering how their response will be perceived by others. Even simple language choices can reveal authority structures. When someone says, "We usually handle this in a particular way," it may signal the presence of a group or leadership structure influencing their decision-making. By understanding these authority networks, you gain insight into how ideas must be positioned in order to gain acceptance. Sometimes the key to influence is not convincing the person you are speaking with, but aligning your message with the individuals or institutions they trust. The fourth skill within strategic listening is the art of questioning. Questions are among the most powerful tools in communication because they guide attention. The right question does more than gather information. It shapes how the other person thinks about the situation. However, poorly structured questions can feel intrusive or interrogative. Strategic communicators avoid this by using a natural progression of inquiry that encourages openness. A useful method is what can be called the excavation sequence. It begins with broad, open questions that invite the other person to share their perspective. What is your view on the current situation? This creates space for expression without pressure. Next, come more focused questions that explore specific aspects of the issue. What part of the situation has been most challenging? This begins to uncover priorities and concerns. Then come emotional questions that explore the human impact of the situation. How has that affected your work or your team? Finally, deeper questions reveal the desired outcomes. If everything worked perfectly, what would the ideal solution look like? This progression feels like a natural conversation while gradually uncovering critical insights. Another powerful listening technique is mirroring communication styles. People tend to feel comfortable with those who communicate in ways similar to themselves. Strategic listeners subtly adjust their pace, tone, and vocabulary to align with the style of the person they are speaking with. If someone speaks quickly and energetically, matching their pace can create a sense of alignment. If someone prefers careful, analytical explanations, slowing down and offering detailed reasoning may build stronger rapport. This adaptation should feel natural, not forced. The goal is not imitation, but compatibility. When communication styles align, conversations flow more smoothly, and trust develops more easily. Silence is another powerful tool in strategic listening. Many people feel uncomfortable with pauses in conversation. They rush to fill silence with additional explanations, clarifications, or unnecessary words. Strategic communicators use silence deliberately. After asking a thoughtful question, they allow a pause to exist. This pause creates space for the other person to think, and often to share more than they originally intended. People frequently reveal deeper insights simply to avoid the discomfort of silence. In negotiations, this technique can be particularly powerful. The person who speaks first after a pause often reveals information or concessions that were not previously planned. The final level of strategic listening involves recognizing deception or incomplete information. Most people do not lie directly in conversations. Instead, they omit details, exaggerate certain aspects, or use language designed to create a particular impression. Strategic listeners pay attention to inconsistencies. If someone describes a situation with extreme confidence, but avoids discussing specific details, it may signal uncertainty. If someone provides unusually elaborate explanations for simple questions, it may indicate they are trying to control the narrative. Equally important is noticing what people do not say. Which obvious questions remain unanswered? Which topics are carefully avoided? Often, the missing pieces of a conversation are more revealing than the statements that are spoken openly. When you combine emotional awareness, value recognition, authority mapping, strategic questioning, adaptive communication, and careful observation, listening becomes a powerful advantage. Conversations transform into sources of insight. You begin to understand not only what people say, but why they say it. And once you understand motivations clearly, influence becomes far easier. Because persuasion rarely begins with speaking, it begins with understanding. Chapter 4. Confidence Projection. Confidence is one of the most misunderstood forces in communication. People often believe confidence is an internal emotion, something you either feel or you do not. They assume it comes from personality, upbringing, or natural charisma. Some people seem to have it effortlessly, while others believe they must struggle to find it. But elite communicators understand a different truth. Confidence is not primarily a feeling. It is a set of behaviors. And those behaviors send powerful signals to the people around you. When someone communicates with clear confidence, listeners instinctively interpret it as competence. They assume the person understands the situation. They believe the ideas being presented are worth considering. They feel more comfortable trusting the direction of the conversation. When confidence is absent, the opposite occurs. Even good ideas begin to sound uncertain. Listeners start questioning whether the speaker fully understands what they are saying. The difference between these two perceptions often has nothing to do with the quality of the ideas themselves. It comes from how those ideas are delivered. Elite communicators learn to project confidence deliberately. They understand that confidence is communicated through voice, language, posture, and presence long before the listener evaluates the logic of the message. One of the most powerful channels for confidence projection is the voice. Your vocal patterns carry enormous information about your emotional state and perceived authority. Subtle differences in pitch, pacing, and tone can completely change how your words are interpreted. Many people unintentionally weaken their communication through vocal habits developed during moments of uncertainty. When they feel nervous, they often speak more quickly than usual. Their voice may rise in pitch, especially at the end of sentences, turning statements into questions. They may also fill pauses with words such as like, or which signal hesitation and uncertainty. Elite communicators develop deliberate vocal control. They slow their speaking pace slightly, which allows listeners time to process their ideas. This slower pace also creates the impression that the speaker is comfortable with silence and does not feel pressured to rush. They lower their pitch slightly, especially at the end of key statements. This pattern, sometimes called authoritative intonation, signals certainty and finality. Instead of filling pauses with filler words, they allow silence to exist. Silence, when used intentionally, conveys thoughtfulness and composure. These small adjustments dramatically change how the same message is perceived. Another important component of confidence projection is precise language. People who feel uncertain about their ideas often use vague or tentative phrases. They may say, "I think maybe we should consider," or "I'm not entirely sure, but perhaps." While caution can sometimes be appropriate, excessive hedging weakens the perceived strength of your message. Confident communicators use language that is clear and direct. Instead of tentative phrases, they frame their ideas as thoughtful conclusions. Rather than saying, "I think this might work," they might say, "Based on the evidence we have, this approach is likely to be effective." This shift does not exaggerate certainty. Instead, it communicates that the speaker has considered the issue carefully and reached a reasoned position. Body language also plays a critical role in confidence projection. Long before you begin speaking, people form impressions based on your physical presence. Posture, eye contact, and movement all communicate subtle signals about how you see yourself within the conversation. Many people unconsciously adopt defensive or minimized body language when they feel uncertain. They cross their arms, avoid eye contact, hunch their shoulders, or shrink their physical presence. These behaviors send signals of discomfort and low authority. Confident communicators adopt open, balanced postures. They stand or sit upright with relaxed shoulders. Their gestures are purposeful rather than nervous. They maintain steady eye contact, while occasionally looking away to avoid appearing confrontational. When standing, they distribute their weight evenly rather than shifting constantly. When seated, they occupy their space comfortably without appearing aggressive. These behaviors communicate stability and presence. Another surprising aspect of confidence is the role of vulnerability. Many people believe that confidence requires projecting perfect certainty at all times. They assume that admitting uncertainty or acknowledging limitations will weaken their credibility. In reality, the opposite is often true. When someone pretends to know everything, listeners frequently sense the lack of authenticity. Overconfidence without evidence creates suspicion. Elite communicators practice what can be called strategic vulnerability. They acknowledge uncertainty when it genuinely exists, but they do so calmly and directly. If they lack specific information, they might say, "I don't have that data at the moment, but I will find it and follow up." If they make an error, they acknowledge it clearly and move forward. This approach strengthens credibility because it demonstrates intellectual honesty and self-awareness. True confidence does not require pretending to be flawless. It requires the composure to address reality directly. Preparation is another powerful source of authentic confidence. While confidence can be projected through behavior, it is always strengthened by genuine competence. Elite communicators rarely enter important conversations unprepared. They study the subject matter, anticipate likely questions, and consider possible objections. This preparation creates internal clarity. When you know your material thoroughly, your delivery naturally becomes more stable and assured. Preparation also allows you to respond calmly when unexpected questions arise. Even if you do not know the exact answer, you can address the issue thoughtfully rather than reacting defensively. Another important element of confidence projection is the management of nervous energy. Nearly everyone experiences anxiety before important conversations, presentations, or negotiations. The presence of nerves does not indicate weakness. It simply means the moment matters. Elite communicators do not attempt to eliminate this energy entirely. Instead, they learn to channel it productively. Physical movement before important conversations can release excess tension. Deep breathing can calm the nervous system. Some individuals even adopt brief posture adjustments, sometimes called power poses, to activate physiological responses associated with confidence. Equally important is the mental reframing of nervousness. The physical sensations of anxiety, accelerated heartbeat, heightened awareness, increased energy, are remarkably similar to the sensations of excitement. By consciously interpreting this energy as readiness rather than fear, communicators can transform nervousness into focused engagement. Finally, true confidence requires contextual awareness. Different environments require different expressions of confidence. In a formal presentation, confidence may appear through structured expertise and careful explanation. In a creative discussion, it may appear through openness to new ideas. In negotiations, confidence may appear as calm persistence rather than aggressive dominance. Elite communicators adapt their expression of confidence to the needs of the situation while maintaining a consistent sense of self-possession. Confidence, at its highest level, is not about overpowering others or appearing flawless. It is about creating an atmosphere of calm competence that reassures others they are in capable hands. When people sense that steadiness, they naturally listen more closely. They begin to trust the direction of the conversation. And gradually, without force or pressure, your influence begins to grow. Chapter 5. The high-stakes communication system. Most conversations in daily life carry relatively low consequences. Casual discussions with friends, routine meetings, or simple exchanges rarely determine major outcomes. But there are moments when communication becomes different. Moments when the stakes are high. These moments may involve critical negotiations, career-defining presentations, tense conflicts, or decisions that affect many people. In such situations, every word carries more weight. Emotional tension rises. Reactions become sharper and less predictable. And this is where the true difference between average communicators and elite performers becomes visible. Under pressure, most people lose clarity. Their thinking becomes reactive. Emotions begin to dominate their responses. They either become overly aggressive in an attempt to assert control or overly passive in an attempt to avoid conflict. Elite communicators respond differently. They treat high-stakes communication as a system rather than an improvisation. Instead of relying on instinct alone, they operate with frameworks that allow them to remain composed, even when the situation becomes intense. The first principle of this system is emotional regulation under pressure. When tension increases, the human brain activates its survival mechanisms. The fight-or-flight response prepares the body for immediate action, but it often reduces our ability to think strategically. Heart rate rises. Breathing becomes shallow. Attention narrows toward perceived threats. In communication, this can lead to defensive responses, impulsive remarks, or emotional escalation. Elite communicators develop the ability to observe these physiological responses without becoming controlled by them. One of the most effective methods for achieving this control is mental rehearsal. Before entering important conversations, they imagine the most challenging scenarios that could occur. They visualize difficult questions, unexpected criticism, or strong opposition. Then they mentally rehearse responding calmly and thoughtfully. This technique, sometimes referred to as pressure inoculation, conditions the mind to treat stressful situations as familiar rather than threatening. When the real moment arrives, the communicator's nervous system recognizes the pattern. Instead of panic, there is recognition and readiness. The second component of high-stakes communication is rapid message construction. In intense situations, there is rarely time to craft elaborate explanations. Responses must be clear, structured, and persuasive within seconds. Elite communicators rely on simple frameworks that allow them to organize ideas quickly. One particularly effective structure can be summarized as position, reason, example, benefit. First, clearly state your position. Then explain the primary reasons supporting that position. Next, provide a concrete example that illustrates the point. Finally, describe the benefit or consequence that follows. This structure keeps communication focused and coherent even when time is limited. It prevents the common mistake of speaking too long, revealing unnecessary information, or wandering away from the central point. Another critical skill in high-stakes communication is the ability to read group dynamics. Many important conversations involve multiple participants with different priorities, personalities, and power levels. In such environments, influence rarely comes from addressing everyone equally. Instead, it comes from understanding who truly shapes the outcome. Elite communicators quickly identify the key players. Who holds formal authority? Who influences others informally? Who is likely to support your position? Who may feel threatened by it? Once these dynamics are understood, communication becomes more strategic. Messages can be framed to address the concerns of influential individuals while maintaining broader alignment with the group. Coalitions begin to form naturally around ideas that acknowledge the priorities of multiple stakeholders. Another important principle is strategic information management. Information is power in high-stakes conversations. Revealing too much too early may weaken your position. Revealing too little may undermine credibility. Elite communicators manage information deliberately. They begin with their strongest and most defensible points. They observe how the audience responds before revealing more sensitive details. They also keep certain evidence or arguments in reserve in case strong challenges arise later in the discussion. This graduated disclosure allows them to maintain flexibility and control over the direction of the conversation. Handling aggression is another challenge in high-pressure communication. In tense situations, some individuals attempt to dominate discussions through confrontation, interruptions, or emotional intensity. Responding aggressively often escalates the conflict. Responding passively can signal weakness. Elite communicators use a balanced approach that acknowledges the emotion without surrendering control. One effective method follows 3 steps: acknowledge, redirect, refocus. First, acknowledge the concern or frustration being expressed. For example, I understand that this issue is creating frustration. Second, redirect attention toward facts or shared information. For example, let's look at the data we have available. Finally, refocus the discussion on mutual objectives. For example, our goal is to find a solution that works for everyone involved. This method diffuses emotional intensity while preserving strategic direction. High-stakes communication also often involves extracting commitments. People under pressure frequently avoid making clear decisions. They hedge their responses, delay conclusions, or shift responsibility. Elite communicators guide conversations toward concrete outcomes without appearing forceful. One technique involves assuming agreement while discussing implementation details. Instead of asking whether someone will take action, they ask questions about how that action will be carried out. For example, when you begin implementing this next week, what resources will you need? This subtle shift encourages commitment while preserving the other person's sense of autonomy. Another crucial skill is managing mistakes. In high-pressure environments, errors can occur. Information may be incomplete. Misunderstandings may arise. The way these mistakes are handled often matters more than the mistake itself. Elite communicators respond quickly and directly. They acknowledge the issue clearly. They take responsibility without excessive apology. Then they immediately redirect attention toward solutions. For example, the timeline I mentioned earlier was incorrect. That was my mistake. Here is the updated information, and here is how we can adjust the plan moving forward. This approach reinforces credibility rather than damaging it. Finally, high-stakes communication extends beyond the immediate conversation. What happens after the meeting can significantly influence the final outcome. Elite communicators follow up strategically. Within a short time after the discussion, they contact key participants individually. They clarify any unresolved questions, reinforce important points, and address concerns that may not have been expressed publicly. This follow-up often transforms uncertain observers into supportive allies. Over time, mastering high-stakes communication changes how others perceive you. When pressure rises and emotions intensify, people naturally look for individuals who remain calm, thoughtful, and focused. When you consistently demonstrate that composure, you begin to stand out, not as the loudest voice in the room, but as the one person who can think clearly when it matters most. And in critical moments, clarity is influence. Chapter 6. The Negotiation Mastery System. Most people approach negotiation as a battle. They imagine two sides competing over limited resources. One side wins more, the other loses more. Each concession feels like defeat, and each gain feels like victory. This mindset creates tension from the very beginning. When both parties see the interaction as a fight, communication becomes defensive and rigid. Positions harden, trust disappears. Creative solutions become nearly impossible. Elite negotiators see negotiation very differently. To them, negotiation is not a battle. It is a design process. The objective is not to overpower the other person. The objective is to architect an outcome where your interests are satisfied while the other party still feels successful. When this happens, agreements become stronger, relationships become more durable, and opportunities for future collaboration emerge. The foundation of negotiation mastery begins before the negotiation even starts. Elite negotiators understand that information is leverage. The individual who understands the situation most clearly almost always has the advantage. This does not require deception or manipulation. It simply requires preparation. Before entering a negotiation, skilled communicators invest time in understanding the other party's world. What pressures are they facing? What constraints influence their decisions? Who must approve the outcome? What would success look like from their perspective? Often the visible topic of negotiation, price, schedule, resources, is only a small part of the real situation. Behind every position are deeper interests. For example, a company negotiating aggressively over cost may actually be worried about internal budget approval. A manager pushing for strict deadlines may be under pressure from their leadership team. A partner requesting specific conditions may be trying to protect their reputation within an organization. When you understand these underlying motivations, new possibilities begin to appear. One of the most powerful techniques in negotiation is anchoring. The first number or proposal mentioned in a negotiation often becomes a psychological reference point that shapes the rest of the discussion. If someone suggests a price of 100 units, future offers will tend to revolve around that figure, even if the original number had little objective justification. However, anchoring must be used carefully. If the opening position is too extreme, it can create distrust or resistance. The other party may feel that the negotiation is not being conducted in good faith. Elite negotiators anchor their proposals within a range that stretches expectations but remains believable. They support their position with reasoning. They reference market conditions, comparable agreements, or value delivered. This approach shifts the psychological starting point of the negotiation without damaging credibility. Another essential skill is concession management. Inexperienced negotiators often give concessions quickly in an attempt to move the discussion forward. Unfortunately, this behavior teaches the other party that additional concessions may be available. Elite negotiators treat every concession as valuable. Even when a concession costs them very little, they present it thoughtfully. They explain that the adjustment is unusual or difficult, and they link the concession to something they would appreciate in return. For example, normally we would not include that additional service, but given the long-term nature of this partnership, we could consider it if we finalize the agreement this week. This approach creates psychological reciprocity. Each concession becomes part of a balanced exchange rather than a one-sided compromise. Another way elite negotiators expand possibilities is by introducing multiple variables. When negotiations focus on a single issue, such as price, the discussion easily becomes win-lose. One party gains only if the other party gives up something. But most agreements involve many dimensions: timing, delivery schedules, payment terms, service levels, guarantees, exclusivity arrangements, and future opportunities can all be adjusted. By expanding the number of variables in the conversation, negotiators create opportunities for creative trade-offs. Something that costs you very little may be extremely valuable to the other party. Likewise, something that is easy for them to provide may solve a significant challenge for you. These asymmetries create the space for agreements where both sides feel satisfied. Time is another powerful force in negotiation. Deadlines often influence decisions more strongly than arguments. However, many negotiators misuse time pressure by creating artificial urgency. When this pressure is obvious, it can trigger skepticism or resistance. Elite negotiators focus on understanding real deadlines. What happens if the agreement is delayed? Who faces consequences? How flexible are those timelines in reality? By understanding the true constraints on both sides, negotiators can manage time strategically. Sometimes patience is the most powerful move. When you are willing to wait while the other side feels pressure to act, your position naturally becomes stronger. Handling objections is another essential component of negotiation mastery. When someone raises a concern, many people respond defensively. They attempt to argue against the objection or dismiss it entirely. Elite negotiators treat objections as valuable information. An objection reveals what matters most to the other party. It highlights the specific issue preventing agreement. Instead of resisting the objection, skilled communicators acknowledge it first. That is a reasonable concern. This simple validation lowers defensive barriers. Next, they isolate the objection to confirm that it is the primary obstacle. If we could address that issue, Would the rest of the proposal make sense? Finally, they reframe the objection within the broader value of the agreement. For example, the timeline is challenging because we are maintaining the quality standards that our clients expect. That commitment is precisely why this solution has produced reliable results. In this way, the objection becomes an opportunity to reinforce the strengths of the proposal. One of the most overlooked sources of negotiation power is alternatives. Your negotiating strength does not come from the arguments you present. It comes from your ability to walk away. If you depend entirely on reaching a particular agreement, the other party will sense that dependence. Even subtle signals of desperation weaken your position. Elite negotiators develop genuine alternatives before entering negotiations. They explore other partnerships, consider different strategies, and remain open to multiple outcomes. When you truly have options, your behavior changes naturally. You become calmer, more patient, and more selective. Interestingly, the other party often senses this confidence even when alternatives are never mentioned explicitly. Finally, negotiation mastery requires emotional intelligence. High-pressure discussions often involve strong emotions: frustration, urgency, pride, or fear. Instead of reacting impulsively to these emotions, elite negotiators observe them carefully. They recognize when emotional responses are genuine and when they are strategic. They acknowledge feelings without allowing them to dominate the conversation. Sometimes the most effective response to anger is calm curiosity. I can see this issue is very important to you. Help me understand what is driving that concern. This response both reduces tension and reveals valuable information. At its highest level, negotiation mastery is not about defeating the other party. It is about designing outcomes where your success and their success can coexist. When both sides leave the table believing the agreement serves their interests, something powerful happens. The negotiation does not end with the contract. It becomes the beginning of a long-term relationship built on trust and mutual value. And that kind of agreement is far more powerful than any short-term victory. Chapter 7. Advanced People Reading. Most people take conversations at face value. They hear the words being spoken, interpret them literally, and assume those words accurately represent the other person's thoughts and intentions. But communication rarely works that way. Human beings are remarkably complex communicators. We constantly filter what we say, soften certain truths, exaggerate other points, and sometimes hide our real concerns altogether. Even when people try to be completely honest, their emotions, fears, and social instincts influence how they express themselves. As a result, the true meaning of a conversation is often only partially contained in the words themselves. Elite communicators understand this deeply. They listen to words, but they also study the signals surrounding those words. These signals, facial expressions, vocal tone, body movement, language patterns, form a continuous stream of information about what people are really thinking and feeling. Reading these signals accurately is not mind reading. It is a disciplined process of observation and interpretation. The first step in advanced people reading is establishing a behavioral baseline. Every individual has a natural way of communicating. Some people speak quickly and energetically. Others prefer a slower, more deliberate pace. Some maintain steady eye contact, while others glance away frequently while thinking. These behaviors are not necessarily indicators of honesty or deception. They are simply part of a person's natural style. Before interpreting any signals, elite communicators observe how someone behaves in neutral situations. How do they sit? How animated are their gestures? What tone do they normally use when discussing ordinary topics? Once this baseline is understood, deviations become meaningful. If someone who usually speaks calmly suddenly becomes hesitant or defensive when discussing a particular topic, that shift may signal discomfort or concern. The change itself is the important information. Another important component of people reading is recognizing micro-expressions. Human emotions often appear on the face for extremely brief moments before conscious control masks them. These fleeting expressions may last less than a second, but they can reveal genuine reactions before social filters intervene. Psychologists have identified several universal emotional expressions that appear across cultures. These include happiness, sadness, anger, fear, surprise, disgust, and contempt. When a person hears information that triggers one of these emotions, their face may briefly display the reaction before returning to a controlled expression. For example, someone might say, "That proposal sounds excellent," but a brief flash of concern may appear before the smile returns. This momentary signal does not necessarily mean the person is being deceptive. However, it does suggest that their reaction may be more complex than their words alone indicate. With practice, communicators can train themselves to notice these subtle cues. The voice is another powerful source of information. Most people focus primarily on the content of speech, but vocal patterns reveal emotional states with remarkable clarity. Changes in pitch, pace, and volume often reflect internal tension or enthusiasm. A voice that becomes slightly higher or faster may indicate stress or excitement. A slower, more measured tone may indicate caution or careful consideration. Breathing patterns also influence vocal quality. When someone becomes anxious, their breathing often becomes shallow, which subtly affects how their voice sounds. By listening carefully to these vocal signals, communicators gain additional insight into the emotional dynamics of the conversation. Body language provides yet another layer of information. However, interpreting body language requires caution. Single gestures can easily be misunderstood. For example, crossed arms might indicate defensiveness, but they might also simply reflect comfort or habit. Elite communicators therefore look for clusters of signals rather than isolated gestures. When multiple signals point in the same direction, the interpretation becomes more reliable. For instance, a person leaning back, crossing their arms, avoiding eye contact, and giving short responses may collectively signal disengagement or resistance. In contrast, someone leaning forward, maintaining eye contact, nodding frequently, and using open gestures is likely engaged and receptive. Language patterns also reveal deeper insights about how people think. Individuals tend to use certain types of sensory language when describing experiences. Some people favor visual expressions such as, "I see what you mean." Others prefer auditory language such as, "That sounds right." Still others rely on feeling-oriented phrases like, "That feels correct." These preferences often reflect how the individual processes information internally. By noticing these patterns, communicators can adapt their own language to match the listener's cognitive style. If someone frequently uses visual language, describing ideas in terms of images or perspectives may resonate strongly with them. If someone prefers feeling-based language, emphasizing practical experience and tangible outcomes may be more persuasive. Another valuable skill in people reading is recognizing potential signs of deception or incomplete information. Most individuals rarely tell direct lies during conversations. Instead, they may omit certain details, exaggerate specific aspects of a story, or present information in ways that shape perception. Several signals may indicate this type of information management. For example, a sudden increase in self-touching gestures, such as touching the face or neck, can sometimes accompany stress or discomfort. Excessively defensive language, such as "to be completely honest," may occasionally appear when someone feels pressure to appear credible. Stories that contain unusually vague descriptions or unnecessary details may also signal attempts to distract attention from important points. However, it is essential to approach these signals carefully. None of these behaviors prove deception by themselves. They are simply indicators that further observation may be useful. Advanced people reading also involves understanding group dynamics. In meetings or discussions involving several participants, influence often flows through informal channels rather than formal titles. Observing interaction patterns reveals these structures. Who speaks first when a question arises? Whose comments receive immediate agreement? Who interrupts others without consequences? Even subtle signals, such as who people look at before responding to a question, can reveal where authority truly resides. Understanding these dynamics allows communicators to position their ideas strategically. Rather than addressing everyone equally, they can ensure that influential individuals feel respected and engaged. Finally, advanced people reading requires cultural and individual awareness. Different cultures express emotions and intentions in different ways. What might appear evasive in one context could simply reflect politeness or humility in another. Similarly, personality differences influence communication styles. Introverted individuals may pause longer before speaking, not because they are uncertain, but because they are carefully processing their thoughts. High-energy personalities may gesture dramatically without any emotional intensity behind those gestures. Elite communicators avoid rigid assumptions. Instead, they remain curious observers, constantly refining their understanding of the individuals they interact with. When these observational skills develop, conversations begin to feel very different. You notice patterns others overlook. You detect emotional shifts early. You recognize hidden concerns before they are spoken aloud. This awareness does not give you control over people, but it does give you clarity. And in communication, clarity is one of the most powerful advantages a person can possess. Chapter 8. Conflict Resolution Mastery. Most people see conflict as something negative. They associate it with tension, arguments, and damaged relationships. Because of this, many people try to avoid conflict entirely. They change the subject, suppress their opinions, or withdraw from difficult conversations in the hope that the problem will disappear. Others respond in the opposite way. They treat conflict as a contest of strength, pushing aggressively to prove they are right and the other person is wrong. Both approaches usually create worse outcomes. Avoiding conflict allows problems to grow beneath the surface until they eventually explode. Aggressive confrontation often escalates the emotional intensity and damages trust. Elite communicators approach conflict very differently. They see conflict not as a threat, but as information. Every disagreement reveals something important that was previously hidden: unmet expectations, competing priorities, or unspoken frustrations. When handled skillfully, conflict becomes an opportunity to uncover these issues and build stronger understanding between people. The first and most essential skill in conflict resolution is emotional regulation. When disagreements arise, the human nervous system often reacts immediately. Heart rate increases, breathing becomes shallow, and the brain prepares for confrontation. This reaction can cause people to speak impulsively or defensively. Words are chosen poorly. Tone becomes sharper. The conversation quickly escalates into a struggle for dominance rather than a search for solutions. Elite communicators train themselves to pause before reacting. One simple but powerful technique involves slowing the breath deliberately. Taking a slow breath before responding activates the body's calming mechanisms and allows the rational mind to regain control. Lowering the volume of your voice can also reduce emotional intensity in the room. When one person remains calm, it often encourages others to regulate their emotions as well. This calm presence becomes an anchor for the entire interaction. Another critical step in resolving conflict is reframing the situation. Many disagreements escalate because people view the situation as a battle between opposing sides. You are wrong. I am right. Your idea versus my idea. Elite communicators shift the framing. Instead of positioning the discussion as a contest, they frame it as a shared problem that both parties are trying to solve. For example, rather than saying, "You misunderstood the situation," they might say, "It seems we are seeing this situation from different perspectives." This subtle shift reduces defensiveness and creates psychological space for cooperation. Language plays a powerful role in this process. Replacing confrontational phrases with collaborative language can dramatically change the tone of a conversation. Instead of saying, "That plan won't work," a communicator might say, "Let's explore some potential challenges with that approach." Instead of assigning blame, they focus attention on the issue itself rather than the individuals involved. This creates an atmosphere where both sides can discuss the situation without feeling personally attacked. Another essential technique in conflict resolution is tactical empathy. This does not mean agreeing with the other person or abandoning your own position. It means demonstrating that you genuinely understand how the other person sees the situation. Many conflicts escalate because individuals feel misunderstood or ignored. When someone believes their perspective has not been acknowledged, they often repeat their argument with increasing intensity. Tactical empathy interrupts this cycle. By acknowledging the other person's concerns clearly, you reduce the emotional pressure driving the conflict. For example, "I understand that you are frustrated because the timeline feels unrealistic given your current workload." This statement does not necessarily mean you agree with their conclusion, but it demonstrates that you recognize their experience. Once people feel understood, they become far more open to hearing alternative viewpoints. Another important principle in conflict resolution is separating people from positions. During heated discussions, individuals often become personally attached to their proposed solutions. Their identity becomes tied to defending those positions. When someone challenges the idea, it feels like a personal attack. Elite communicators shift the focus away from defending positions and toward exploring underlying interests. Instead of debating whether a specific solution is correct, they ask questions such as, "What outcome are you hoping this approach will achieve? What concerns led you to prefer that option?" These questions uncover the deeper motivations behind the proposed solution. Once those motivations are understood, alternative solutions often become easier to identify. Both parties may discover that they share the same goals, but were pursuing different strategies to achieve them. Managing power dynamics is another challenge in many conflicts. Sometimes one individual holds formal authority over the other. In other situations, one person may possess more experience, influence, or confidence. These imbalances can complicate discussions. If the more powerful person dominates the conversation, the other party may feel unable to speak honestly. If the less powerful individual becomes confrontational, the discussion may become defensive or dismissive. Elite communicators acknowledge these dynamics openly when appropriate. A leader might say, "I want to hear your honest perspective, even if you disagree with my initial view." By inviting genuine input, they reduce the pressure created by hierarchy. When someone holds less formal authority, focusing on shared goals can be effective. Instead of framing the discussion as a challenge to authority, they emphasize mutual success. For example, we both want this project to succeed. Let's explore what adjustments might help us achieve that outcome. Another useful technique involves strategic concession. Not every issue in a conflict carries equal importance. Elite communicators identify which elements matter most to each party. Often, one person cares deeply about a particular detail that is relatively unimportant to the other. By conceding that point, they create goodwill and encourage reciprocal flexibility. These exchanges create solutions that satisfy both sides rather than forcing compromise that leaves everyone dissatisfied. Timing also plays an important role in conflict resolution. When emotions are extremely intense, attempting to resolve the issue immediately may be ineffective. In such moments, elite communicators sometimes suggest a brief pause. For example, "This conversation is important, and I want to make sure we approach it thoughtfully. Let's take some time and continue tomorrow when we can discuss it more calmly." This pause allows emotional intensity to subside and gives both parties time to reflect more clearly. Once a conflict has been resolved, elite communicators take an additional step. They use the experience to strengthen the relationship. They discuss what they learned about each other's communication styles, priorities, and expectations. For example, "This conversation helped me realize that early notice about schedule changes is especially important for your team. I will make sure we address that moving forward." By identifying these insights, both sides reduce the likelihood of similar conflicts in the future. In this way, conflict becomes a tool for improving communication systems, rather than simply resolving isolated problems. At its highest level, conflict resolution mastery transforms disagreement into growth. Instead of weakening relationships, difficult conversations become opportunities for deeper understanding and stronger collaboration. People begin to see you not as someone who creates conflict, but as someone who can guide others through it. And when individuals know that you can help turn tension into progress, they will often seek your presence when challenges arise. Chapter 9. Authority Building. Authority is one of the most powerful forces in communication. When someone is perceived as an authority, their ideas receive attention more easily. Their recommendations carry greater weight. Their presence influences decisions even before they speak. Yet many people misunderstand how authority actually works. They believe authority comes primarily from titles, job positions, or formal power structures. While these elements can influence perception temporarily, they are not the true foundation of lasting authority. Real authority is psychological. It exists in the minds of the people around you. It is the quiet recognition that you possess insight, competence, and judgment that others trust. When this perception exists, people naturally begin to seek your perspective. They defer to your recommendations, not because they must, but because they believe your thinking will help them make better decisions. Elite communicators understand that authority can be built deliberately through consistent behavior and strategic positioning. The first step in building authority is demonstrating expertise. Simply possessing knowledge is not enough. Many highly capable individuals remain unnoticed because they rarely express their insights clearly or consistently. Authority requires visible competence. This does not mean boasting about accomplishments. Instead, it involves contributing ideas that help others understand situations more clearly. When you analyze complex problems and explain them in simple, practical ways, people begin to associate you with clarity. When you consistently share useful insights that improve decisions, people begin to associate you with value. Over time, this pattern builds a reputation. People begin to think, "This person understands how things work." Another important element of authority is thought leadership. Authority figures do not simply respond to existing conversations. They shape them. Instead of repeating widely accepted ideas, they introduce frameworks that help others interpret problems differently. They challenge assumptions. They offer perspectives that reveal patterns others have not yet noticed. When these insights prove valuable, people begin referencing those ideas in future discussions. Your thinking becomes part of the intellectual landscape of the group or organization. This process transforms you from a participant in conversations into a contributor who influences how those conversations unfold. Another powerful way authority develops is through visible competence during challenging situations. Moments of difficulty often reveal who truly understands a problem and who does not. Elite communicators do not avoid these moments. Instead, they approach them as opportunities to demonstrate capability. When others hesitate to address complex issues, they offer thoughtful analysis. When uncertainty appears, they provide structure and direction. Successfully navigating difficult challenges builds credibility quickly. People remember who remained calm, insightful, and solution-focused when situations became complicated. Authority is also strengthened through social proof. Human beings naturally evaluate credibility based on the opinions of others they respect. If respected individuals acknowledge your insight, collaborate with you, or publicly value your perspective, that recognition transfers credibility to you. Elite communicators cultivate relationships with individuals who are respected within their networks. These relationships are not transactional. They are built through mutual value, collaboration, and shared intellectual curiosity. When respected figures associate themselves with your work or ideas, their credibility becomes partially linked to yours. Another essential element of authority is consistency. Trust develops when people see reliable patterns over time. A single impressive insight may attract attention briefly, but consistent value delivery builds lasting influence. Elite communicators create regular opportunities to contribute meaningful ideas. They might share thoughtful analysis during meetings, write articles explaining complex topics, or provide structured guidance during important projects. Over time, people begin to expect these contributions. Your voice becomes associated with thoughtful perspective. Another interesting aspect of authority involves accessibility. Many people believe that authority requires constant availability. They attempt to respond to every request immediately in order to appear helpful. Paradoxically, this behavior can reduce perceived authority. When someone appears constantly available for every minor issue, their attention begins to feel less valuable. Elite communicators maintain a balance. They are generous with insights and thoughtful responses when important issues arise. But they are also selective about how they invest their time. This balance signals that their attention carries value. People begin to approach conversations with greater preparation and respect, because they recognize that the interaction matters. Authority also expands through networks. Influence rarely spreads through isolated relationships alone. It grows through interconnected networks of individuals who recognize your value. Elite communicators actively cultivate relationships across multiple levels of their professional or social environments. They connect with peers who collaborate with them. They support individuals who are earlier in their careers and may later become influential allies. They maintain relationships with experienced leaders who can offer guidance and visibility. These layered networks amplify authority because recognition spreads organically through different groups. Another powerful method of strengthening authority is teaching. When you help others understand complex ideas, you reinforce your own mastery while expanding your influence. Teaching requires clarity. It forces you to organize knowledge into structured frameworks that others can apply. When people benefit from these explanations, They naturally begin to see you as someone who understands the subject deeply. Mentoring others, sharing insights through writing, or explaining concepts during discussions all contribute to this process. Finally, the most sustainable form of authority is humble authority. Some individuals attempt to appear authoritative by exaggerating their expertise or dominating conversations. While this behavior may create short-term attention, it often damages trust over time. True authority combines confidence with curiosity. Elite communicators are comfortable acknowledging the limits of their knowledge. They give credit generously when others contribute valuable ideas. They remain open to learning from perspectives different from their own. This humility makes their authority feel genuine rather than forced. People trust leaders who demonstrate both competence and authenticity. Over time, authority becomes self-reinforcing. As more people recognize your insight, you gain greater opportunities to contribute. These contributions strengthen your reputation, which in turn creates additional opportunities for influence. Eventually, something subtle but powerful happens. You no longer need to assert authority. Others grant it to you naturally. And when that happens, your communication gains a quiet but undeniable force. Your words carry weight not because they are louder than others, but because people trust the mind behind them. Chapter 10. Verbal precision. Words are not just tools for communication. They are tools for shaping perception. Every sentence you speak influences how people interpret a situation, evaluate choices, and imagine possible outcomes. The exact structure of your language determines whether an idea feels uncertain or inevitable, complicated or simple, risky or promising. Most people use language casually. They say approximately what they mean and assume that listeners will interpret their message correctly. Elite communicators approach language very differently. They treat words with precision. They understand that small adjustments in phrasing can dramatically alter how a message is received. By choosing language carefully, they guide how others think about a situation without forcing agreement. One of the most powerful techniques in verbal precision involves presuppositions. A presupposition is an assumption embedded within a sentence. Instead of arguing directly for an idea, the communicator structures their language so the idea is accepted automatically as part of the statement. For example, consider the difference between these two sentences. If you decide to move forward with this project, we can discuss the next steps. When you move forward with this project, we can discuss the next steps. Both sentences discuss the same topic, but the second quietly assumes that the decision has already been made. The listener processes the assumption without necessarily challenging it. This technique does not guarantee agreement, but it subtly shapes how the idea is framed in the listener's mind. Another important language pattern involves time framing. How you refer to time can influence the sense of urgency surrounding a decision. If an idea is described as something that can be addressed eventually, it often loses momentum. If the same idea is framed in relation to immediate progress or future consequences, attention shifts. Elite communicators use time strategically. They connect action with positive outcomes in the near future. The sooner we implement this change, the sooner you will begin seeing improvements. At the same time, they highlight the natural consequences of delay. Each month we wait allows competitors to strengthen their position. These patterns create momentum without sounding manipulative. Another dimension of verbal precision involves calibrating certainty. Not every situation requires absolute confidence. In fact, presenting uncertain information with excessive certainty can damage credibility. Elite communicators adjust their language to match the strength of their evidence. When evidence is strong, they use definitive language. This approach will significantly improve efficiency. When evidence is less certain, they maintain credibility by acknowledging probability. This approach is likely to improve efficiency based on current data. By aligning language with reality, they maintain trust while still communicating clearly. Another subtle but powerful influence comes from emotional language. Every word carries emotional weight. Two phrases can describe the same reality but produce very different reactions. Consider the difference between describing a situation as a problem versus an opportunity for improvement. Both refer to a challenge, but the emotional tone changes dramatically. Elite communicators choose words that guide emotional responses in constructive directions. Instead of emphasizing negative labels such as failure or loss, they frame situations as learning experiences, adjustments, or opportunities. These shifts do not change facts, but they change how people feel about those facts, and feelings strongly influence decisions. Another important skill is balancing specificity and generality. Specific language builds credibility. When you reference exact figures, timelines, or examples, your message feels grounded in reality. For instance, this strategy improved productivity by 23% in the first quarter. Such statements carry weight because they appear measurable and concrete. However, general language can sometimes be more persuasive when building agreement. A statement like, "This strategy significantly improves productivity," is harder to argue against because it does not invite scrutiny of precise details. Elite communicators move fluidly between these levels. They use specificity to establish credibility and general language to build consensus. Questions are another powerful instrument of verbal precision. Most people ask questions simply to gather information. Elite communicators ask questions that guide thinking. A well-constructed question directs the listener's attention towards certain possibilities. Instead of telling someone that a particular project should be prioritized, a communicator might ask, "Given your goals for this quarter, what impact would completing this project have?" The listener begins evaluating the idea independently. When they reach the conclusion themselves, they feel ownership of the decision. Another technique involves contrast framing. Humans understand choices more clearly when they are compared side by side. Elite communicators often present options in ways that highlight the advantages of their preferred solution. For example, "We could continue using the current system and accept the ongoing inefficiencies, or we could implement the new process and eliminate those delays permanently." This structure allows the listener to compare outcomes directly, making the preferred option appear logical without explicitly dismissing alternatives. Ownership language is another subtle but effective technique. When people begin describing an idea as if it belongs to them, they become psychologically invested in it. Communicators encourage this shift by asking questions that invite the listener to imagine themselves implementing the idea. How would you introduce this approach to your team? What results would you expect to see after the first month? These questions encourage the listener to visualize success. The idea begins to feel like part of their own thinking. Authority language also contributes to verbal precision. Some people attempt to establish credibility by announcing their expertise directly. Statements such as, "I am an expert in this field," rarely persuade others. Elite communicators demonstrate authority indirectly. They reference their experience through examples and observations. In similar projects we managed last year, the most effective solution was. This phrasing signals experience without appearing self-promotional. Finally, verbal precision includes adaptive language matching. People feel more comfortable with individuals who communicate in familiar patterns. If someone prefers discussing big-picture concepts, Responding with detailed technical analysis may create confusion. If someone focuses on measurable results, abstract philosophical explanations may feel irrelevant. Elite communicators listen carefully to how others speak. Then they adjust their own language to match those patterns while still expressing their ideas clearly. When communication styles align, the message feels natural rather than forced. Verbal precision is not about manipulating people with clever phrases. It is about expressing ideas in ways that make them easier to understand, easier to evaluate, and easier to accept. When your language becomes deliberate and precise, conversations begin to change. Ideas become clearer. Decisions become easier. And your words begin to carry influence far beyond their length. Chapter 11. Persuasion Mastery. Most people believe persuasion begins when you start explaining your idea. They prepare arguments, collect evidence, and attempt to prove why their proposal makes sense. If the other person resists, they add more logic, more examples, and more explanation. Yet persuasion rarely works this way. Human beings do not make decisions purely through logic. In most situations, the emotional brain reaches a conclusion first, and the rational mind builds explanations afterward. Elite communicators understand this psychological sequence. Instead of forcing arguments, they shape the conditions that make agreement feel natural. By the time the logical discussion begins, the listener already feels inclined toward the idea. This is why the most effective persuasion often feels effortless. The first step in persuasion mastery is what can be called desire architecture. Rather than trying to convince someone to want something new, elite communicators begin by discovering what the other person already wants. Every individual carries internal motivations, goals they hope to achieve, frustrations they want to eliminate, and outcomes they would find deeply satisfying. When a proposal connects directly to these motivations, persuasion becomes far easier. Instead of pushing a separate agenda, the communicator positions their idea as a pathway to achieving the listener's existing goals. For example, if a manager values efficiency above all else, a persuasive proposal will emphasize how the solution reduces wasted time and increases productivity. If another individual prioritizes innovation and creativity, the same solution may be framed as a way to unlock new possibilities. In both cases, the idea remains the same. Only the connection to the listener's motivations changes. Another essential skill in persuasion is resistance preemption. Many communicators wait for objections to appear before addressing them. Unfortunately, this creates a subtle adversarial dynamic. The moment an objection emerges, the conversation shifts into defense and counter-argument. Elite communicators often address potential concerns before they arise. For example, they might say, "You may be wondering whether implementing this approach would require too much time. That is a valid concern, and here is how we can simplify the process." This approach accomplishes two things simultaneously. First, it demonstrates that the communicator understands the listener's perspective. Second, it removes the emotional tension associated with raising objections. The listener feels understood rather than challenged. Another powerful persuasion tool is social proof. People are strongly influenced by the experiences of others who resemble them. When individuals see that people with similar goals, backgrounds, or challenges have already taken a particular path successfully, their hesitation decreases. Elite communicators collect detailed examples of such experiences. Rather than offering vague testimonials, they describe real situations where individuals faced similar decisions, evaluated their options carefully, and achieved positive outcomes. These stories help listeners imagine themselves experiencing the same success. Another important technique involves commitment escalation. Large decisions often feel intimidating. If someone is asked to make a significant commitment immediately, they may hesitate simply because the step feels too large. Elite communicators guide conversations through a sequence of smaller agreements. First, they confirm shared understanding of the problem. Would you agree that this situation is creating unnecessary delays? Next, they explore possible solutions. Do you think this approach could address that issue? Finally, they discuss practical implementation. What would be the first step if we decided to move forward? Each small agreement builds psychological momentum. By the time the final decision appears, it feels like a natural continuation of the previous steps. Another key persuasion skill is value reframing. People evaluate ideas based on the comparison points available to them. If a solution is compared only to the effort required to implement it, it may appear costly or inconvenient. But if the same solution is compared to the long-term cost of maintaining the current situation, the evaluation changes. Elite communicators shift these comparison frames deliberately. Instead of asking whether a proposal requires investment, they explore the consequences of doing nothing. What will the situation look like a year from now if the current challenges remain unresolved? This question encourages the listener to consider the hidden costs of inaction. When these costs become visible, the proposed solution often appears far more attractive. Urgency is another powerful element of persuasion. Artificial pressure, such as exaggerated deadlines, often triggers skepticism, but genuine urgency arises naturally when people recognize that opportunities have limited windows. Markets evolve, competitors adapt, and problems intensify over time. Elite communicators help others recognize these realities without exaggeration. They clarify how timing influences outcomes. For example, while we are discussing this possibility, other organizations are already exploring similar strategies. Acting sooner could give us a significant advantage. This approach motivates action while preserving trust. Another sophisticated persuasion technique involves transforming objections. When someone raises an objection, it often reveals their priorities. Instead of seeing objections as barriers, elite communicators treat them as valuable information. For instance, if someone says, "This approach is too expensive," the communicator might respond, "Cost is definitely an important factor. What level of return would make this investment worthwhile?" This response acknowledges the concern while guiding the conversation toward constructive evaluation. The objection becomes the starting point for deeper exploration. Emotional state management is also critical for persuasion. People process information differently depending on how they feel. When someone feels anxious, they may become cautious and risk-averse. When they feel excited, they may become open to ambitious ideas. Elite communicators observe these emotional states and adapt their approach accordingly. If someone appears skeptical, they respond with evidence and careful reasoning. If someone appears enthusiastic, they channel that energy toward envisioning positive outcomes. In this way, persuasion aligns with the listener's emotional context rather than ignoring it. The highest level of persuasion mastery involves ethical influence. The most effective communicators genuinely believe that their ideas will benefit the people they are speaking with. This authenticity creates alignment between their words and their intentions. Listeners often sense this alignment intuitively. When someone feels that a proposal genuinely serves their interests, resistance diminishes. In contrast, when persuasion is driven purely by self-interest, subtle signals of manipulation often emerge. Trust erodes quickly. Ethical persuasion focuses on creating outcomes where both sides benefit. It is not about forcing agreement. It is about helping people recognize opportunities they may have overlooked. When persuasion is practiced this way, people do not feel pressured. They feel enlightened. And when individuals believe that your ideas consistently help them make better decisions, something remarkable happens. They begin seeking your guidance voluntarily. Persuasion no longer requires effort. Your influence becomes part of how others think. Chapter 12. Digital Communication Excellence. The modern world has changed communication in profound ways. Conversations that once happened face-to-face now occur through screens, emails, messaging platforms, and virtual meetings. Entire decisions are made through written messages or brief video calls. Teams collaborate across continents without ever sharing the same physical room. These changes have created new opportunities for influence, but also new challenges. In physical conversations, communication relies on many signals beyond words. Tone of voice, facial expressions, posture, eye contact, and subtle social cues all contribute to meaning. Digital communication removes many of these signals. When communication occurs through text or screens, words carry almost the entire burden of meaning. Misinterpretations become more common. Attention spans shrink. Competing notifications constantly pull people away from the conversation. Elite communicators adapt to this environment deliberately. They understand that digital communication requires stronger clarity, greater intentionality, and more structured messaging than traditional conversation. The first principle of digital communication excellence is virtual presence. In video meetings, many people fade into the background. Their voice blends into the discussion. Their contributions feel distant or forgettable. Elite communicators approach virtual environments as performance spaces. They position their camera at eye level so that their gaze appears natural and confident. Lighting is adjusted so their face is clearly visible, allowing expressions to be easily read. Background distractions are minimized to maintain focus. But the most important adjustment is energy. Screens absorb emotional intensity. What feels energetic in person often appears subdued in digital environments. For this reason, effective communicators project slightly more energy than feels natural. Their voice carries clarity and engagement. Their facial expressions are visible and intentional. This energy helps maintain attention in environments where distractions are constant. The second essential skill in digital communication is written persuasion. Email, messaging platforms, and documents require a completely different communication strategy than spoken conversations. Without vocal tone or body language, structure becomes crucial. Elite communicators organize written communication in a way that guides the reader's attention clearly. One effective structure follows 4 stages: attention, interest, desire, and action. First, capture attention immediately. The opening sentence should communicate relevance. It should answer the silent question every reader asks: why should I care about this message? Next, build interest by presenting useful insight, a compelling observation, or a question that stimulates curiosity. Then create desire by explaining how the information benefits the reader or helps solve a specific problem. Finally, guide action by making the next step clear. Whether the action involves scheduling a meeting, reviewing a proposal, or responding with feedback, clarity eliminates hesitation. Another critical skill in digital communication is managing asynchronous conversations. Unlike real-time discussions, digital messages are often read hours or even days after they are written. The reader may have forgotten previous context or may be reading the message quickly while multitasking. Elite communicators anticipate this reality. They structure messages so that each communication stands independently. Key context is briefly summarized. The purpose of the message is stated clearly. Instead of assuming the reader remembers earlier details, they include essential background information directly. This approach reduces confusion and increases the likelihood of meaningful responses. Attention management is another major challenge in digital environments. Online communication competes with a constant stream of distractions. Notifications, emails, messages, and alerts divide attention into fragments. To overcome this challenge, elite communicators design messages for quick scanning. Paragraphs remain short and focused. Key points appear early. Formatting elements, such as spacing, bullet points, or bold text, highlight important ideas. This structure allows readers to understand the message even if they initially skim it. If the message captures interest quickly, they are more likely to return and read it carefully. Another aspect of digital communication involves relationship building. Without physical interaction, trust and rapport require more intentional effort. Elite communicators create connection by remembering personal details from previous conversations and referencing them later. They acknowledge milestones, successes, and challenges experienced by colleagues or partners. They follow through on commitments promptly, reinforcing reliability. Small gestures, such as brief check-in messages or thoughtful responses, strengthen relationships even when communication occurs remotely. Leading virtual meetings is another area where communication mastery becomes essential. Many digital meetings become inefficient because participants feel disconnected from the discussion. Without engagement, attention drifts quickly. Elite facilitators structure virtual meetings carefully. They invite participation by asking direct questions and addressing participants by name. Polls, chat responses, or short interactive segments keep attention active. Visual aids are used thoughtfully to clarify ideas rather than overwhelm participants with information. At the end of the meeting, clear action steps are summarized so that everyone understands the outcome. Digital communication also requires adapting to different platforms. Email works well for detailed explanations and formal decisions. Instant messaging platforms are better suited for quick coordination and informal updates. Video calls are ideal for complex discussions requiring emotional nuance. Collaborative documents allow teams to contribute ideas simultaneously. Elite communicators select the platform that best matches the objective of the communication. Instead of defaulting to familiar tools, they choose the medium that will make the message most effective. Another powerful advantage of digital communication is scalability. Through digital channels, a single message can reach hundreds or even thousands of people. However, influence at scale requires careful balance. Messages must feel personal even when delivered to large audiences. Elite communicators accomplish this by addressing shared concerns while acknowledging individual perspectives. They respond thoughtfully to comments and questions, reinforcing the sense that each participant matters. Finally, the most important principle of digital communication is authenticity. Technology can easily create emotional distance. Messages can feel mechanical or impersonal. Elite communicators overcome this barrier by expressing genuine interest and appreciation through digital channels. Voice messages, thoughtful responses, and occasional personal insights help maintain human connection. Even in digital environments, people respond most strongly to authenticity. When individuals sense that your communication is sincere and thoughtful, trust develops naturally. Digital communication excellence is not about mastering technology. It is about adapting timeless communication principles to modern environments. When you learn to communicate with clarity, structure, and authenticity through screens and text, Your influence becomes independent of location. Your ideas travel farther. Your voice reaches more people. And your ability to shape conversations extends far beyond the room you are physically in. Chapter 13. The Psychology of Silence. Most people believe communication is about speaking. They assume influence comes from the ability to explain ideas clearly, present arguments persuasively, and fill conversations with confident words. Yet some of the most powerful communicators in the world rely on something far less obvious: silence. Silence is not the absence of communication. It is one of its most powerful forms. When used intentionally, silence shapes conversations in ways that words alone cannot achieve. It creates psychological space, shifts power dynamics, and encourages others to reveal information they might otherwise withhold. Unfortunately, many people feel uncomfortable with silence. When a pause appears in conversation, they rush to fill it. They repeat ideas, add unnecessary explanations, or change the subject entirely. This instinct is understandable. Silence can create a sense of uncertainty. People worry that a pause may signal disagreement, confusion, or awkwardness. Elite communicators learn to see silence differently. Instead of avoiding it, they use it strategically. One of the most important functions of silence is information extraction. After asking a thoughtful question, many communicators immediately begin speaking again. They clarify the question, provide examples, or offer suggestions. But when silence follows a question, something interesting happens. The other person begins thinking. Human beings feel a natural urge to resolve silence during conversations. When a pause appears, people often respond by expanding their answer. They reveal additional thoughts, provide deeper explanations, or disclose concerns that might otherwise remain hidden. Elite communicators ask clear questions and then allow silence to work. Another powerful use of silence appears in negotiation. During discussions about decisions, proposals, or agreements, many individuals feel pressure to justify their position continuously. If the other party does not respond immediately, they may interpret the pause as resistance. In an attempt to persuade, they begin offering concessions or additional explanations. Elite negotiators remain comfortable with silence. After presenting an offer or proposal, they allow the pause to exist. Often, the other party becomes uncomfortable with the silence and begins speaking first. In doing so, they may reveal their priorities, concerns, or negotiating boundaries. Silence also functions as a signal of confidence. When someone speaks rapidly without pauses, it may suggest nervousness or urgency. The speaker appears eager for approval or validation. In contrast, individuals who speak calmly and allow brief pauses between ideas project a different impression. They appear thoughtful, they appear composed, they appear confident that their ideas deserve reflection. These pauses give listeners time to process information and emphasize the importance of what has been said. Another important role of silence involves emotional regulation. During moments of tension, conversations can escalate quickly. A critical remark may trigger defensiveness. A disagreement may lead to raised voices or emotional reactions. When someone responds immediately to emotional comments, the intensity often increases. Elite communicators use silence to interrupt this escalation. Instead of reacting impulsively, they pause. This pause accomplishes two things simultaneously. First, it gives the communicator time to choose a thoughtful response rather than an emotional reaction. Second, it often reduces the emotional momentum of the conversation. The other person, seeing the calm response, may also begin to slow down. Silence can also be used to emphasize important points. When a key idea is delivered and followed by a brief pause, the listener naturally reflects on the statement. The pause acts like punctuation in spoken language. It signals that something significant has just been said. Speakers who move too quickly from one idea to the next often prevent their audience from absorbing important insights. Elite communicators allow silence to highlight meaning. Another subtle effect of silence is authority signaling. In group discussions, individuals who feel uncertain often speak frequently in order to remain visible. They contribute comments on many topics, even when their ideas are not fully developed. Those with greater confidence often speak less frequently but more deliberately. When they do speak, others listen carefully because their words are rare and considered. Silence, in this context, communicates selectivity and thoughtfulness. People begin to associate your contributions with quality rather than quantity. Another powerful use of silence involves observation. When you are not speaking, you are free to observe. You can notice how others react to ideas. You can see which participants agree, which hesitate, and which remain quiet. You can observe subtle shifts in tone, posture, and engagement. These observations provide valuable insight into group dynamics and hidden concerns. Many communicators miss these signals because they are too focused on preparing their next statement. Silence creates space for awareness. However, effective silence must feel natural rather than awkward. Pauses that are excessively long or poorly timed may create confusion. Elite communicators therefore use silence briefly and intentionally. A pause after a question. A pause after an important idea. A pause before responding to emotional comments. These moments are usually only a few seconds long, but they change the rhythm of the conversation dramatically. Finally, silence encourages reflection. In a world filled with constant noise, messages, notifications, opinions, and interruptions, moments of quiet attention are increasingly rare. When someone feels that you are truly listening without rushing to respond, they often feel respected and valued. They become more willing to share honest thoughts. Trust grows. In this way, silence strengthens relationships as well as communication effectiveness. Mastering silence does not mean avoiding speech. It means understanding that communication is a rhythm between words and pauses. When you learn to use both intentionally, conversations become more thoughtful. You begin hearing what others truly mean. You gain time to respond with clarity rather than reaction, and gradually, people begin to notice something different about your presence in conversations. You do not simply speak, you create space for understanding. Chapter 14. The Long-Term Influence Effect. Most people think influence happens in a single conversation. They imagine persuasion as a moment. One powerful argument, one brilliant speech, one perfectly delivered idea that instantly changes someone's mind. But real influence rarely works that way. The most powerful influence is cumulative. It is built slowly through patterns of behavior that people observe over time. Every conversation, every interaction, every small moment contributes to how others perceive you. Elite communicators understand this. They know that influence is not built through isolated moments of persuasion. It is built through consistency. When people repeatedly see you offering thoughtful insights, keeping your commitments, and approaching conversations with calm clarity, they begin forming a reliable impression of you. And once that impression is formed, it becomes powerful. People begin evaluating your ideas differently, not just based on the words themselves, but based on the reputation you have built. This is the long-term influence effect. One of the most important elements of this effect is reputation consistency. Reputation is essentially the memory of your behavior stored in the minds of others. Every interaction adds to that memory. Elite communicators treat even small conversations with care. They respond thoughtfully, follow through on commitments, and avoid careless behavior that could damage trust. Over time, this consistency creates credibility. People begin assuming that your actions will match your words. And when that trust exists, influence grows naturally. Another key factor is intellectual generosity. Some individuals guard their knowledge carefully, believing that sharing ideas freely will reduce their advantage. But elite communicators often do the opposite. They share insights that help others think more clearly. They explain complex ideas in ways that make them useful. When people repeatedly benefit from your thinking, they begin to value your perspective. Later, when you present new ideas or proposals, those same individuals are far more receptive because they remember how your insights have helped them before. Emotional reliability also plays an important role. People feel comfortable around individuals whose emotional responses are steady and predictable. If someone reacts unpredictably, sometimes supportive, sometimes dismissive, others become cautious. Elite communicators remain calm during disagreements. They acknowledge different perspectives and approach challenges with thoughtful composure. This stability creates psychological safety. People feel comfortable speaking openly, which makes meaningful influence possible. Another powerful factor is patience. Many individuals expect influence to appear quickly. When their ideas are not immediately accepted, they become frustrated. But influence grows slowly. Trust, credibility, and reputation develop through repeated interactions over time. Elite communicators understand this. They invest in relationships even when no immediate benefit is visible. Eventually, these investments compound. People remember who consistently brought clarity to discussions and helped move conversations forward. And over time, something remarkable begins to happen. You no longer need to persuade people aggressively. Your reputation speaks before you do. People listen carefully when you speak because they trust your thinking. They support your ideas because they believe your intentions are constructive. This is the quiet power of long-term influence, not built through force, but earned through consistency, clarity, and trust over time. Conclusion: the true power of communication is not found in speaking more. It is found in understanding more. Most people enter conversations trying to prove their ideas or defend their position. But the master communicator approaches communication differently. They listen carefully. They observe the emotional signals beneath the words. They recognize motivations, fears, and goals that shape how people think. Because of this awareness, their words carry weight. They do not need to dominate conversations or argue aggressively. Instead, they guide discussions with clarity, patience, and thoughtful language. When they speak, people listen, not because they are loud, but because they are precise. Real influence grows through consistency. Every conversation contributes to how others perceive you. When people see that your presence brings insight, calm thinking, and genuine understanding, they begin to trust your judgment. Over time, your voice becomes one that others seek during important decisions. This is the essence of communication mastery. Not control, not manipulation, but the ability to help people see situations more clearly. And in a world filled with noise and constant opinions, the person who can create clarity will always have influence.